Okay, welcome to the deep dive. This is where we grab a really interesting source, crack it open, and, well, pull out the absolute must-know stuff.
That's right. No wading through endless pages. We do the heavy lifting. You get the insights.
Think of us as your guides, really, navigating the intellectual terrain so you can jump straight to the fascinating bits.
Exactly. And today, we're diving into something ancient, but wow, still so relevant. Plato's dialogue, The Statesman.
Yeah, and we're using the Benjamin Jowett translation specifically. That includes his introduction and the dialogue itself.
And our mission, sort of following the lead of the characters in the dialogue, the stranger and young Socrates, is to try and track down the definition of a true statesman.
Figure out how to tell the real deal from the imposters and really understand what Plato thought political science actually is.
It's quite a journey. Get ready for some pretty rigorous logical steps, some,
Right.
let's say, unusual analogies, and even a famous old myth.
All in the service of trying to nail down what makes an authentic leader. Okay, let's get into it.
So the main tool Plato uses here, his core method, is this process of division and then subdivision.
Right, like he did in the Sophist, if you're familiar with that one. You start broad and just keep slicing the categories finer and finer.
Exactly, based on defining characteristics until you isolate the very thing you're looking for. It's like a process of elimination, almost.
Okay, so first big cut. He divides all arts and sciences into theoretical, basically knowledge for its own sake, like math, and practical, which is knowledge applied to doing something, like, say, building.
And the question is, where does statesmanship fit? Plato argues it's more on the theoretical side.
Why theoretical? Seems like ruling is pretty practical.
Well, his reasoning, as the source puts it, is that the king rules with his mind. Not directly with his hands. He gives the commands, the orders, but others do the physical execution.
Ah, okay, so it's a science of knowledge or command rather than direct action. Got it. A theoretical command-based art. What's next?
So within those theoretical sciences, you can split again. You've got sciences that just judge or discriminate, like arithmetic telling numbers apart.
Right.
Or you have sciences that rule or superintend, like an architect directing the workers. And statesmanship, well, it clearly falls into that second category. It's a ruling science.
Okay, ruling science. But lots of things involve ruling. Ruling lifeless things like a potter and clay, or ruling living things.
Exactly. And the statesman, obviously, is managing living beings.
I think makes sense.
And then managing living beings, you could be tending to individuals, maybe like a horse groom or a doctor with one patient, or you could be managing whole herds, whole groups.
And the statesman is dealing with the group, the collective management, as the source said.
Precisely. Collective management of living things.
Okay, feels like we're zeroing in, but this is where their first attempt at dividing the herds runs into trouble, and it's such a classic Platonic point about classification.
It really is. They initially try to divide the herd of living things into just men and beasts. Seems logical on the surface, doesn't it?
Yeah, pretty straightforward. Humans here, animals there. What's wrong with that?
Well, Plato, through the stranger, points out the flaw. It's kind of like dividing all of humanity into Greeks and barbarians. Or his other example, dividing numbers into the number 10,000 and then just all the other numbers.
Ah, I see. You're just lopping off one tiny specific piece and then lumping everything else, regardless of its own variety, into one huge, undefined other category.
Exactly. It's not a real division through the middle of the category based on some fundamental shared characteristic of the parts. It's just isolating one bit.
It doesn't respect the actual structure of the group.
Right. And he uses this brilliant analogy. Imagine if a crane could talk and classify things. It would probably divide all animals into cranes and everything else that isn't a crane.
Huh, yeah, okay. Shows how arbitrary and self-centered that kind of division is. It doesn't tell you much about the animal kingdom, just about the crane's perspective.
Precisely. So the principle, he insists, is that divisions should try to cut through the middle. They should separate genuine classes or species that reflect real distinctions within the whole group. A class is always a part, but just any old part isn't necessarily a meaningful class.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. You need a principled way to divide things, so how do they correct it?
They back up. Start again with the whole class of animals. First split. Tame versus wild. Statesmanship concerns tame animals.
Okay.
Then divide the tame animals into gregarious, those that live in herds, and non-gregarious, the solitary ones. The statesman deals with gregarious tame animals.
All right, still making sense.
And they keep going, slicing finer and finer. Land versus water herds. Then within land herds, winged versus walking.
Okay.
Then within walking herds, horned versus hornless. Then within hornless walking herds, those whose breed mixes freely versus those whose breed doesn't mix.
Wow, that is incredibly detailed, almost comically so.
It is. But it's illustrating the rigor of the method. And the final result of this rather elaborate logical dissection.
What is it?
The statesman emerges as the shepherd or manager of a polled herd. That means hornless of walking, gregarious, tame animals, which are bipeds, two-footed.
Which basically brings us to humans, the art of man-herding.
Exactly, the art of man-herding.
Okay. So we've arrived at a definition through this painstaking division, but as you hinted, that image, man-herding, it feels, well, a bit simplistic now, doesn't it?
It really does, because as the dialogue immediately points out, think about a literal shepherd with sheep. That shepherd is usually the sole provider, right?
Yeah.
Feeds them, doctors them, maybe even pairs them up for breeding.
Yeah, they do pretty much everything for the flock.
But the supposed herdsmen of humanity, they've got a whole crowd of competitors, or at least other people involved in the care of humans.
Oh, right. Who does Plato list as these potential rivals or maybe just participants?
The source mentions merchants, farmers providing food, people involved in physical training, doctors. They all play a role in the care, the rearing, the sustenance of human beings.
So unlike the lone shepherd, the statesman isn't the only one looking after the herd. Lots of others have a piece of that action.
Exactly. And then the source brings in another group of rivals, and the language gets really dramatic here. These aren't just other necessary professions. These are the imposters.
Ooh, okay. The pretenders to the throne?
You could say that. They're described vividly like lions and centaurs and satyrs, these sort of monstrous mixed-up figures that appear in various guises.
Who are they specifically?
He lumps together the politician and his troop, the chief of sophists, big target for Plato, always, the prince of charlatans, even the accomplished of wizards.
Wow. So basically anyone who claims political wisdom or power, but doesn't actually possess the true scientific art. The sophists, the smooth talkers, the power grabbers.
Exactly those. And Plato stresses that these characters, especially the very clever sophists, must be carefully distinguished from the true king or statesman. We need a way to tell them apart.
Okay, so how do we make that crucial distinction? Seems like we need more than just the definition by division.
We do. And this is where the dialogue takes a fascinating turn and introduces, as the source calls it, a famous ancient tale, a myth.
A myth. To help define a statesman, how does that work?
Well, the myth is about the entire cosmos, the universe itself. The story goes that the universe alternates between two huge cycles, two vast ages.
Okay.
In one age, it's guided directly by a divine power, like God steering the ship of the world. Everything's orderly, directly managed from above.
That's nice.
And then in the other age, the divine power lets go, withdraws. And the universe is left to spin on its own spontaneously, but also falling into, well, a bit of chaos. And this reversal, this change of cosmic management, causes huge disruptions for everyone living in it.
Right. And the myth focuses on two specific ages that are relevant to understanding the statesman.
Exactly. First, there's the age of Chronos. This is when the divine being was the direct shepherd of humankind.
The golden age, sort of.
Pretty much. Effortless care, food grew spontaneously, no harsh weather, peace, tons of leisure. The source even suggests humans might have chatted with animals and spent their time on philosophy because, well, all their basic needs were just met. Divinely.
Paradise. But that's not our age, clearly, so what's the other one?
That's our age, the age we live in now. This is when the divine pilot has let go of the tiller. The world's moving on its own steam, but spontaneous order and provision have failed.
So things get tough.
Very tough. Spontaneous food disappears. Humans are suddenly vulnerable, attacked by wild beasts, left helpless and without help, as the text says.
Yikes. What happens then? Do they just die out?
No. This is where human ingenuity, prompted by necessity, comes in. And the gods, seeing their plight, step in not to rule directly anymore, but to give gifts. Prometheus gives fire, Hephaestus and Athene gave the arts and crafts, others give seeds and plants.
Ah, so humans get the tools to survive and manage themselves.
Exactly. They become their own masters, needing to use these arts to build societies, grow food, defend themselves, and generally order their own lives because the divine easy mode is over.
Okay, I think I see the point of the myth now. It's not just a story. It's drawing a massive contrast.
Between what?
Between that ideal divine shepherd from the age of Chronos who provided everything effortlessly and the human statesman of our age. Our statesman has to operate in a world where that divine care is gone.
Precisely. The human statesman's job is fundamentally different. They have to manage a world where things don't just automatically work out, where humans need arts and organization to survive and thrive. They aren't a godlike shepherd providing spontaneous sustenance.
So that man-herding idea needs an upgrade. It's less about feeding and rearing like sheep.
And more about caring and managing a society of beings who are now, in large part, responsible for themselves and possess their own arts and skills.
Right. And that shift from mere feeding to this broader caring and managing helps separate the royal science from all those other necessary arts we mentioned, the farmer, the doctor, the trainer.
Yeah, they all contribute to human well-being, but the royal science, the statesman's art, has the sort of prior claim, the overall responsibility for guiding and ruling human society as a whole. It directs the others.
Okay, so focusing now on this human management in our age, the source introduces another key division, right?
Yes, a really crucial one for politics. Voluntary versus compulsory rule.
How does that break down?
Well, if the management is compulsory, done through violence and force against the will of the people, that's labeled tyranny.
Okay, straightforward enough, the bad kind of rule.
But if the management is of voluntary subjects, the source says voluntary bipeds, which is kind of amusing, people who consent to be governed. That is identified as politics. The true art of the king and the statesman involves ruling over willing subjects.
Voluntary management of voluntary bipeds, that's the goal. But then they raise this potentially tricky point about ruling without laws. That sounds a bit dangerous, doesn't it? Isn't law supposed to be good?
It usually is, yeah. But Plato, through the stranger, makes a really subtle argument here. He brings back those analogies of the skilled physician and the skilled ship's pilot.
Right. What's the point with them?
Think about it. Does the best doctor just rigidly follow textbook procedures regardless of the patient in front of them? No. A truly skilled doctor adapts the treatment based on the patient's specific changing condition, day by day, hour by hour sometimes.
Okay. And the pilot?
Same idea. Does the best pilot just stick blindly to a pre-plotted course if a sudden storm blows up or the winds change dramatically? Of course not. They use their skill, their art, their science to adapt to the immediate reality of the waves and wind to keep the ship safe.
Ah, so true expertise, true science in any field is flexible. It responds to the unique particulars of the situation.
Exactly. True art is portrayed as a kind of dynamic, flexible science. So the argument goes, the ideal form of rule, the absolute best, would be by a ruler who possesses this perfect political science. Someone so wise they could adapt their decisions perfectly to every unique situation, always aiming for the true good of the state without being rigidly bound by pre-written general rules.
That ruler wouldn't need laws because their scientific understanding would be a better guide.
In this ideal scenario, yes. But, and this is the huge but, where do laws come in?
Why do we have them then?
Because, as the dialogue acknowledges, that kind of perfectly wise scientific ruler is incredibly, incredibly rare, maybe doesn't even exist, or we can't reliably find them.
Okay, so laws are?
Laws are presented as necessary copies or imitations. They're like written prescriptions based on the average case or the typical situation derived from the experience of what the wise ruler would likely do. They are general rules created for the majority of situations and for the majority of rulers and citizens who lack that perfect, adaptable scientific knowledge.
So laws are a second-best solution, a practical necessity because the ideal, the philosopher king with perfect political science, is basically unattainable for most societies most of the time.
That seems to be exactly the idea here. They arise from our inability to secure that perfect scientific rule. Therefore, the true government, the ideal seventh form Plato posits, is ruled by the one, or the very few, who genuinely possesses this political science.
And their legitimacy comes from the science itself, not necessarily from whether they use laws or whether people initially consent or if they're rich or poor.
That's the radical claim. If they have the science and use it for the genuine good of the state, their rule is considered the true form, philosophically speaking. Though, again, voluntary rule is preferred.
That is definitely a challenging idea. That scientific rule could, in theory, be superior even to the rule of law. Okay, so bearing that radical ideal in mind, how does Plato then classify the governments we actually see? You know, monarchy, oligarchy, democracy.
Right, he circles back to those conventional forms. But he expands on them by applying that lawfulness criterion. So, the basic three forms, rule by one, rule by few, rule by many, each split into two versions.
Okay, let's break that down. Monarchy becomes
royalty, which is lawful rule by one, aiming at the good. And its opposite, tyranny, which is lawless rule by one, usually for selfish ends.
Got it. Rule by the few.
That splits into aristocracy, lawful rule by a select few, supposedly the best for the common good. And its shadow oligarchy, typically lawless rule by a few, often the wealthy, for their own benefit.
Makes sense. And rule by the many.
Democracy.
Yeah.
That also splits. You have lawful democracy where the masses rule but respect established laws and constitutions. And then you have lawless democracy where the masses rule, perhaps swayed by demagogues disregarding laws and procedures. So that gives you 6 forms in total.
6 imitations, he calls them, of that true 7th form. Okay, how does he compare these 6? Does he rank them?
He does. And it's quite interesting. He looks at them in terms of their potential for good and evil and how easy or hard they are to live under.
Right.
Rule by one monarchy, he says, is both the hardest and easiest, meaning when it's lawful royalty, it has the potential to be the best form of government, the most effective for good. But when it's lawless tyranny, it's by far the worst, the most oppressive and capable of evil.
Because one person with absolute unchecked power can do the most damage.
Exactly. Then, ruled by the few aristocracy and oligarchy, he ranks as intermediate. They're sort of in the middle in terms of both their potential for good and their potential for evil. Less effective for good than the best royalty, but less destructive than the worst tyranny.
Okay, middling. What about democracy ruled by the many? This is where it gets surprising, right?
It really does.
Yeah.
He describes democracy ruled by the many as fundamentally weak in all its forms.
Weak.
Yeah. And because of this weakness, paradoxically, lawful democracy ends up being ranked as the worst of the lawful forms of government.
Wait, worse than lawful monarchy, royalty, or lawful rule by the few? Aristocracy. Why?
His reasoning seems to be that its inherent diffusion of power, the need for broad agreement, the potential for slowness and inefficiency, its weakness, makes it less capable of achieving decisive, great good compared to a strong, well-run monarchy or aristocracy operating under law.
Okay, that's quite a critique. Lawful democracy is the least effective lawful form in his view here.
That's the ranking. But then comes the flip side. Because it's weak, democracy is also the best of the lawless forms.
How does that work?
If you have to live under a government that disregards law, democracy is the least bad option. Why? Because its very weakness, its internal divisions and checks, prevents it from inflicting the kind of swift, concentrated, catastrophic harm that a single lawless tyrant or a small, unified, lawless oligarchy can unleash. It's too fragmented and inefficient to be truly terrifyingly evil on a grand scale compared to the other lawless forms.
Wow, okay. So if you're stuck with lawlessness, you're safest in a democracy because it's too weak and messy to be effectively tyrannical. That's a backhanded compliment if ever I heard one.
It absolutely is. It's a stark assessment of democracy's perceived limitations on efficacy, both for good and evil. And he contrasts all 6 of these imitations, these flawed systems.
Is the 7th form again?
Yes, with that ideal 7th form, the true government, ruled by genuine political science, which stands apart from considerations of number, wealth, or even strict adherence to existing laws. This true form, the source declares dramatically, excels them all and is among states what God is among men. It's the transcendent ideal.
And the rulers in those everyday imitation governments, he doesn't hold back on describing them, does he?
No, not at all. They get called partisans, mere upholders of the most monstrous idols, sometimes just idols themselves. He calls them the greatest imitators and magicians, and, linking back to his other critiques, the greatest of sophists.
So the rulers of ordinary states are basically seen as performers, illusionists, maybe even unwitting sophists compared to the true scientific statesmen.
That's the strong implication. They're dealing in copies and illusions, not the real thing.
Okay. So if that's the ideal, this rare statesman with true science, how do they actually operate? How does this true statesman apply their art in practice?
Oh.
We need more than just the definition.
Right. And this is where Plato introduces the final and perhaps most illuminating analogy, the art of weaving, specifically weaving the fabric of the state.
Weaving. How does that work for politics?
Well, think about actual weaving. It doesn't just happen. You need preparatory arts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like carding the wool, spinning the thread. And you need cooperative arts people who make the loom, the shuttle, the tools.
Okay, yeah, lots of supporting activity.
Exactly. And the state is similar. It relies on many necessary but subordinate arts and activities. You need farmers, builders, soldiers, generalship, judges, public speakers, oratory, and so on. All essential threads.
Right. Society needs all those things to function.
But the statesman's art, the royal science, isn't any one of those specific activities. It's presented as the principal art, the master art of weaving itself. It's the art that knows how to combine and integrate all these different threads, these different functions and professions into a strong, coherent social fabric.
So the statesman directs and uses the other arts, like the weaver uses the threads and the tools.
Precisely. It's the overarching, directing art. It's not generalship itself, but it knows when and how to use generalship. It's not judging itself, but it oversees the laws and the judges. It uses oratory, but isn't defined by it.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about the threads within the citizens themselves? Is it just weaving professions together?
No, this is where it gets really deep into human nature. The source argues that the statesman's highest task involves weaving together different types of human character, different virtues that are naturally, or at least potentially, opposed to each other.
Opposed virtues, like what?
Specifically, he focuses on courage, or manliness, boldness, and temperance, or moderation, orderliness, gentleness. These two fundamental aspects of a good character, he suggests, can actually be sort of at war with each other in human nature and in society.
How are courage and temperance at war? They sound like good things.
They are good, but they pull in different directions. Courage is linked to quickness, energy, sharpness, decisiveness. Really valuable traits.
Yeah.
But if they're completely unchecked, they can easily tip over into rashness, violence, aggression, even madness.
Okay, and temperance?
Temperance is associated with slowness, caution, gentleness, orderliness, quietness. Also really valuable. But if that's all someone has, if it's unchecked by any boldness, it can become sluggishness, cowardice, lack of initiative, maybe even a kind of silliness or ineffectiveness.
Right, I can picture that. The purely courageous type might be impulsive and harsh, while the purely temperate type might be too timid and indecisive. They'd likely clash on how to approach, well, almost anything.
Exactly. And the source says these opposing natural tendencies lead to real conflict and factions within a city. People group together based on these affinities. The quick and slow distrust each other, leading to division and weakness in the state.
So the ultimate job of the true statesman, the master weaver, is to take these two naturally clashing threads, the bold, energetic, courageous types, and the careful, orderly, temperate types, and skillfully blend them together.
Yes. Like weaving the strong, firm threads of the warp, he links this to courage, with the softer, more pliable threads of the woof, linked to temperance, to create a single, durable, balanced fabric. That's the political task.
That's a powerful image. How on earth do they do that? How do you weave human natures together?
The primary mechanism, according to the source, is through establishing what's called a divine bond. And this bond isn't mystical. It's implanted by the statesman, acting as a legislator and educator.
A divine bond through education.
Essentially, yes. It's achieved by instilling true knowledge, or at least right opinion, about the good, the just, and the honorable deep within the souls of both types of citizens through a shared sound education.
How does that help blend them?
Because this shared understanding, this common grasp of fundamental truths, acts as an anchor. It civilizes the courageous, making them just, and preventing their energy from becoming mere brutality. And it gives wisdom and, presumably, appropriate firmness to the temperate, preventing their orderliness from becoming ineffective or foolish.
So education and shared values is the divine thread that holds these opposing natures together in a productive way.
That's the core idea. Without this bond of shared truth and right opinion fostered by the statesman's educational project, the courageous just become savage, and the orderly just become, well, silly or easily led. The state falls apart into warring factions.
And isn't there also mention of a human bond?
Yes. Alongside the divine bond of education, there's a more practical human bond, encouraging intermarriage between families primarily characterized by these different temperaments. The idea is to literally blend the natures over generations, preventing either extreme from dominating the population.
Wow, that's social engineering through marriage, basically.
It certainly sounds like it. And this principle of balancing also applies to how the statesman selects officials and assigns roles. You need people with the carefulness, justice, and steadiness associated with temperance, and you need people with the drive, energy, and decisiveness associated with courage. Putting only one type in charge leads to failure.
So a city needs both energetic action and careful deliberation in its leadership, woven together by the statesman.
Exactly. The statesman's job is to recognize these different valuable natures, educate them with shared principles, bind them through social practices like marriage, and then combine them wisely in the actual running of the state. That's the art of political weaving.
Incredible. We've really traced Plato's whole argument here, haven't we? From that initial complex process of division to define the man-herder,
Through using the myth to distinguish the divine shepherd from the human manager.
refining the definition away from simple feeding to complex care, introducing the radical idea of scientific rule potentially trumping law,
Ranking all those imitation governments we actually see.
and finally landing on this beautiful complex analogy of the statesman as a master weaver, blending potentially opposing virtues within the citizenry through education and careful statecraft.
It's an incredibly ambitious picture of what true political leadership entails. It's not just about power or administration. It's about possessing a deep scientific understanding of human nature and society and actively shaping it for the better.
And it definitely leaves you with some big questions, doesn't it? Questions that feel just as relevant today. I mean, how do you recognize this supposedly scientific ruler in the messy reality of politics? Is that even possible?
And that tension between rule by flexible expertise versus rule by stable, predictable laws, Plato pushes hard towards expertise here. But is law just a second best? Or does it have intrinsic values he perhaps underplays?
Yeah, and maybe the biggest one. Can those deep-seated differences in human temperament, the courageous versus the temperate in his terms, or however we'd frame it today, can they really be harmoniously woven together? Can education and leadership truly create that unified fabric?
Or is a certain amount of friction, division, and conflict between these fundamental human tendencies just inevitable in any political community?
Definitely something to chew on as you look at the world around you. Are you seeing attempts at weaving, or are the threads just fraying?